the most closely watched snapshot of the country's economic performance. India has released its GDP growth figure not only for the quarter January to March, but also for the whole year between April 2012 and March 2013. GDP is the sum of how much output the country's economy creates each year, and just how much this is growing is a key indicator of the health of the economy. The annual GDP growth rate for India over 2012-2013 fell to its lowest in a decade at just 5%. And for the quarter January to March this year, the GDP came in at 4.8%, just a slight improvement from 4.5% in the last quarter. These growth levels are the lowest in many years except for one quarter in 2009. But even at 4.8%, India is growing much faster than advanced economies such as the US, UK and Germany. It's also doing better than Japan, which has recently seen its pace pick up. It's however still being outperformed by Asia's biggest economy, China, and another emerging giant, Indonesia. So what's caused the steep downturn? Samir Hashmi sat down with Adi Godrej, chairman of the Godrej Group, and began by asking him just that.
I think clearly 5% growth rate for India is very poor. And despite the global issues, we should have done much better. If the reform platform was going through well, we could have done much better. If the goods and services tax legislation was introduced, we could have done much better. Going forward, I think it will be a little better, but it will depend a lot on major reforms.
So now, is this the new normal? India is going to grow between 5 to 6% going ahead?
No, not at all. The normal for India should be 8 to 10%. This is clearly an aberration. This is clearly because we have failed to take steps as we should have. Project clearances have been held up, certainly not a normal. And I think India will soon get back to an 8% plus growth rate.
Now, the Indian finance minister has been traveling to a lot of countries to attract foreign investors, but the sentiment really hasn't changed there because still a lot of them are wary to invest in India.
No, sentiment has changed for the better, but not sufficiently. I think we still have issues in terms of income tax notices being sent, especially to foreign firms. The Vodafone matter is still not resolved. I think it was a big mistake to retrospectively change the legislation on the Vodafone matter after the Supreme Court had ruled against the government. So I think those issues have to be corrected. The perception is still negative, and if we are able to resolve that, if we are able to resolve these issues, I think a lot more of international investment could come into India.
Now, the Indian Central Bank has cut interest rates in the recent months, but that really hasn't helped much. So what's the way ahead on that?
No, I think we are due for a big cut in interest rates. Global commodity prices are coming down. I think the Reserve Bank has been slow in cutting interest rates. High interest rates is clearly working against GDP growth in our country.
Now, Mr. Godrej, given that there's a political deadlock in the parliament, elections are due next year, do you think it's realistic to expect new reforms to be introduced in the months to come?
The best scenario would be legislation goes through and whatever reforms the government had to initiate by their own action, the progress has been good. However, the reforms that need parliamentary approval, the progress has been slow. So if we can get through some of the reform before the election, well and good. Otherwise, hopefully just after the elections.
The government, though, has managed to stick to one of the promises it made during the budget announcement earlier this year. The Finance Ministry said this past week that they have brought down fiscal deficit, which has been a big worry for the economy, to 4.9% of the GDP as against its target of 5.2%. But is that enough? Samir Hashmi asked Rajiv Lal, Executive Chairman of IDFC, an infrastructure finance company, if the government was on the right track.
Much of the continued momentum and success of fiscal tightening will depend, in my judgment, not so much on just meeting the headline number of the fiscal deficit, because there are different ways in which you can contain government expenditure. It's the easiest thing to slash planned expenditure, investment expenditure. It is much harder to improve the quality of expenditures and be selective about what expenditures are cut and which are maintained. And that's where the impact of fiscal tightening will tell on the growth momentum of the economy.
Now, Mr. Lal, I want to talk to you specifically about infrastructure, because that's one big challenge for the government right now. What's really gone wrong on that front?
I think in infrastructure we've been the victims of our own success. What we have tried to do in the last decade is at unprecedented, historically unprecedented pace, tried to invite private participation in the delivery of infrastructure services. I think worldwide, getting the private sector to deliver services that are quasi-public in nature is tricky. And in India, we've had our own share of learnings from that process.
Now, India needs nearly $1 trillion worth of investment when it comes to infrastructure. How is the government going to get that?
I think one is resolving the issues that have emerged, and a lot of them are in the nature of, when you cut through it all, in the nature of dispute resolution. Resolving those disputes will set a legal precedent and clear up the backlog of a lot of unresolved issues.
Manufacturing is one sector that has been hit hard, but falling growth has also impacted ordinary citizens here in India who are trying to cope with high prices, while incomes and job prospects have taken a hit.